Hi, my name's Tom Bull, and I'm from London, and I am an artist, and I've been living in London for a while now, making sculpture. So yeah, the motivation around my work, I was born up in the countryside in a really small village, and I've always kind of been entertaining myself through making, sort of making dens or sort of making crafted objects by myself and kind of figuring out narratives and imagining kind of worlds through making. And I've always been interested in art because there's this idea of creating things and imagining things around them. And I feel they're a lot like proposals or models. So when I kind of grew up a little bit more and started studying art in more depth and kind of moving to the city, I thought about this sort of way that I used to work when I was younger, sort of making models and thinking about worlds and thinking about what these things are beyond the material presence of them. And I was kind of interested in houses and locations from being kind of brought up in the countryside and then moving to the city. And this idea of kind of making model houses made me sort of think about the kind of housing which is in the countryside and that sort of way of living, and then also the way of living in the city where it's very transient. There isn't this idea of a settled home or this kind of glorified idea of a settled home, which it is in the countryside. And so when I started to move when I was living in the city, I started thinking about kind of this transient thing of the house, or these kind of differences between how you live in the countryside and how you live in the city. So for the festival, I wanted to interrogate that further and kind of really look into the idea of models or the kind of the houses that we live in. So for the festival, I'll make a house that looks like a kind of countryside house, the ones that I'm used to seeing when I was younger, but making it out of perspex. So it's completely see-through. The idea of sort of looking into someone's home and seeing the inner workings, and the idea of like houses being transient or transparent rather than being fixed. So it kind of introduces the language and the experiences that I had in the city, this idea of being watched, or the idea of display in the city, how everything is available and you can see it all the time, compared to the countryside, which is very obscured. So playing with the idea of see-through houses, I will put videos inside them so you can kind of see through the house and see the videos, like peering through someone's window and seeing the inner workings of a house. So that's kind of the motivation of making the work, is sort of thinking about where I was brought up and my attraction towards making things and making models, and now kind of getting a little bit older, sort of analysing what it meant to live in the countryside and what it now means to kind of live in the city. Yeah, so I've previously made quite dark work. So they would be made out of cardboard, a lot of industrial materials that would kind of mimic what it would look like in the countryside. So I make out of clay and hay, which is a traditional material to make houses, but then I then cover them in tar to make it a lot more menacing, these sculptures to be far more industrial or far more powerful and have their own agency. But I wanted to kind of change that up a bit, and like I said, with the transparency of a house or the transparency of a model, I was intrigued this idea of not just surface, but looking through something. And for the acrylic, it kind of provided this sort of see-through layer where you can see an object, but it's almost like a ghostly object. You can see right through it. So it's a lot about peering in or looking. Like a lot of models are, they're all about looking at scale or looking at how something would function, or this idea that a model could be a proposal. It's like looking at an idea or a metaphor. So the clear acrylic allowed me to play with this idea of looking and seeing through an object rather than it just being a solid colour. Yeah, with the meaning, I've kind of got this journey that I've been thinking about when I make, the idea of moving away from the countryside into the city, and that's always been my standpoint of analysing the politics between that, or analysing the differences between the countryside and the city. And within my work, I want to kind of put them more into conflict, not just sort of showing what it's like to live in the countryside or showing what it's like to live in the city, to put those two things together to kind of make an inner conflict within the work. So there isn't this sort of direct meaning about the work translates one thing. It's more like I try and make a complex puzzle or a complex object for people to try and get their head around. It might be the use of materials, so they try and get around why I'm using certain materials or why it looks a certain way. But I think with the meaning, I just want to problematize this idea of living, what humans have created and why we exist in certain areas and how that makes us think. It hasn't got one meaning, it's just this idea to kind of ruminate about you and where you feel your location is or where your understanding of location or home is. The one which kind of changed quite a lot is when I started making work out of tar, so making kind of sculptures and then turning them into these sort of black forms with this sort of paint, this tar paint. Because this tar material is really interesting to me because nowadays in modern times it's used as industrial material to either weatherproof something or to make roads. So I kind of think a lot about roads, this idea of connecting places. So I like the material being part of that broader use where it kind of is for connecting areas. But then also the idea of weatherproofing something means to protect it, to kind of make it last. And I like the idea of these sculptures having a lot of presence and lasting for many years. Again, with that kind of complex thing, if something exists for longer, it's not just transient, it exists forever. You have to really get your head around what it actually is, because it's going to be present for so long. So I really enjoyed this kind of material. And I really enjoyed the kind of act of layering it over the sculptures that I make. It's quite medieval, the way that you kind of coat it in this one ubiquitous kind of material, which is gloopy and thick. So I think the biggest turning point in my work is when I started using that substance on the sculptures or houses or chairs that I make.